Good evening, everyone. This is Ashley from Written in Ash, and tonight's ghost story reading is going to be from the book 13 Ghosts Strange but True Stories by Will Osborne. And tonight's story is called The Ghost in the Rattling Chains. Athendorus wasn't about to be driven out of his new home by a ghost. His landlord had told him the house was haunted, and he had heard the stories of the men who went mad after spending a single night there. But the rent was cheap. Athendorus was poor, and the house was exactly what the old philosopher had been looking for when he came to Athens to study and teach. Athendorus decided to move into the house despite the ghost stories, and he was determined not to be scared off, even if the ghost stories were true. "If there really is a restless spirit here," he said, "perhaps you will be good company for me." Athendorus chose to spend his first night in the house doing what he did every night, writing about the philosophy of life. He prepared a study for himself in one of the rooms by spreading his notes and books out on a table. Then he cooked a simple dinner, ate it as the sun went down, and retired to his study to work. The old philosopher wanted to put ghost stories out of his mind, so that night he chose an especially hard philosophical problem to work on. He was deep in thought when a clanking sound in the distance interrupted his concentration. Athendorus paused for a moment to listen to the noise. It sounded as if heavy chains were being dragged along a stone floor, and the longer he listened, the closer the sound of the clanking chains came to his room. The philosopher took a deep breath and went back to studying his notes. His work was much more important than his fear, he decided, and he was determined not to be shaken from it no matter what happened. The sound of the rattling chains came closer and closer, but still Athendorus sat thinking, writing, and studying his notes. He didn't look up, and he didn't give in to his fear. Finally, it sounded as if the chains were right in front of the room itself, and the clanking was too loud even for the strong-willed philosopher to ignore it any longer. Athendorus looked up from his work, and a cold chill ran down his spine. Standing before him in the flickering light was the figure of a man, or what was left of a man. The figure was so thin he looked like a skeleton. His pale gray flesh hung loosely on his bones, and his long white beard was matted and filthy. There were shackles around his wrists and ankles, and attached to his shackles were long rusty chains. The figure glared at Athendorus, and the look in his eyes was a mixture of rage and misery. Raising his frail arms above his head, he shook his shackles violently, and the sound of the rattling chains echoed through the dark and empty house. Then he motioned with his bony finger for Athendorus to stand up. Athendorus was terrified, but still he didn't give in to his fear. He looked into the figure's eyes, shook his head, pointed to the work, then motioned for the figure to go away and leave him alone. As Athendorus went back to his writing, the figure began to moan in a broken, pained voice. The moaning grew louder and louder, and the figure shook his chain so violently that Athendorus was forced to look up again. The expression on the ghost's face was one of pure agony. Again he beckoned for Athendorus to stand up and follow him. The old philosopher put down his pen and stared into the ghost's pained, wretched face. Then, more in pity than in fear, he picked up his lamp and motioned for the figure to lead the way. Athendorus followed the ghost through the house and out the back door into the yard. The ghost dragged his chains to a clump of bushes in the garden, then turned to Athendorus. He pointed down to the ground, shook his shackles one final time, then disappeared. Athendorus took his lamp to the spot in the shrubbery where the ghost had pointed, but there was nothing there. He broke a few branches on one of the bushes to mark the spot, then went back into his house and went to bed. "This is the spot," Athendorus said to the city magistrate. "Tell your men to dig here." Athendorus had risen early the morning after this encounter with the ghost and reported the incident to the officials of the city of Athens. At first they refused to take the philosopher seriously, but Athendorus was persistent, and eventually he persuaded them to follow him back to his house and investigate. The magistrate's men uprooted the bush at the spot where the ghost had disappeared. Then, as Athendorus and the magistrate looked on, the men began to dig up the earth beneath the bush. It wasn't long before one of the men's shovels struck something hard, buried a few feet below the surface. "Wait," the magistrate called to his men. Taking one of their shovels, he carefully cleared away the earth to reveal a shocking sight. Lying in the shallow grave was a rotting skeleton, and Athenodorus knew as soon as he saw it that the skeleton had belonged to the man whose tortured spirit haunted his house. For there were shackles around the bones of the skeleton's wrists and ankles, and the shackles were attached to heavy, rusted chains. Athenodorus had the chains removed from the skeleton's bones, and the poor man's remains were given a proper burial. After that, Athenodorus never saw the ghost again. Perhaps the dead man's spirit had merely been waiting for someone wise enough to meet him with kindness and pity instead of terror. Athenodorus did just that, and his house was never again haunted by the ghost in the Rattling Chains. This is the oldest ghost story in this book. It was recorded by Pliny the Younger in the 1st century AD. Pliny was a respected Roman historian, and he reported the case to his patron as a true story. The end.
Don't be scared. Like, subscribe, share.